Sometimes a man's greatest fortune becomes his deepest curse when he has no one left to share it with. Gideon Vance knew this truth better than most, the richest man west of the divide, yet poorer than a beggar since his beloved wife passed on. He'd ridden into the woods near Silver Pine, expecting to die alone among the pines and granite. But when he came back months later, he weren't alone. A pack of wild wolves followed him everywhere, calm as old friends, walking beside him through town like they belonged there. Folks whispered about curses and devil's bargains, crossing themselves when they saw him pass. The truth was simpler than any curse. During his darkest hours, Gideon had saved a wounded wolf pup, and the pack had claimed him as family. But what would happen when his old enemies discovered his wild protectors? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The silver pocket watch clicked open in Gideon's weathered hands, its inscription still clear after 30 years. Time teaches us what matters most. Father. He'd carried this watch through every business deal, every triumph, every failure that had built the Vance fortune. Now, as dawn light filtered through his study windows, it seemed to mock him with its steady tick. Time had taught him, all right taught him, that everything he'd built meant nothing without Eleanor's laughter filling these empty rooms. Silver Pine stretched below his mansion like a child's toy town, smoke rising from chimneys as folks started their morning routines. Once, Gideon had owned half those buildings, employed a quarter of those families. They'd respected him then, feared him a little too, which was how he'd preferred it. A man didn't accumulate wealth by being soft, but respect, born of fear, died quick when fear turned to something deeper, something that made mothers pull their children close when he passed. The wolves had changed everything. Sheriff Tom Brennan was the first to speak to him after the whispers started. Good man, Tom. Fought alongside Gideon's father in the Indian Wars, earned his badge through courage rather than politics. He'd knocked on Gideon's door 3 weeks after the return, hat in hand but spine straight. Gideon, we need to talk. About what, Tom? About them shadows that follow you. Tom's eyes had moved to the window, where 4 grey shapes lounged in the morning sun like oversized dogs. Folks are scared. Gideon had followed his gaze to the pack. The alpha, a massive silver-grey male he'd named Ghost, lifted his head as if sensing their attention. The others, Storm, River, and the youngest, they called Scout, remained alert but calm. They'd been with him for 2 months now, ever since he'd stumbled out of those mountains more dead than alive. They ain't hurt nobody, Tom. Ain't about hurting. It's about what folks think you become, up there in them woods. Some saying you made a deal with dark spirits, others claiming you ain't even human no more. Tom's voice carried the weight of friendship stretched thin. Doc Whitmore, he's got his own theories. Doc Whitmore. The man had delivered half the babies in Silver Pine, buried the other half when their time came. If anyone understood the mysteries of life and death, it was him. But even Doc seemed unsettled by Gideon's transformation. The transformation hadn't been intentional. Lord knows, when Gideon rode into those mountains 6 months ago, he'd had simpler plans. Eleanor had been gone 3 months, taken by the fever that swept through town that spring. The house felt like a tomb, every room echoing with her absence. Her perfume still lingered on her pillow. Her reading glasses still sat on the kitchen table beside her unfinished book. He'd tried returning to business, but numbers on ledgers couldn't fill the hollow in his chest. The mines ran themselves now, anyway, good foremen, loyal workers who knew their trade. The investments his father had started continued growing like weeds after rain. Money kept flowing in whether Gideon cared or not. So he'd stopped caring. One morning in late autumn, he'd saddled his black stallion Midnight and rode out with nothing but a bottle of whiskey and his father's hunting rifle. The plan had been simple enough: ride until the whiskey ran out, then use the rifle to end the pain that gnawed at him worse than any physical wound. But the mountains had other ideas. 3 days in, a storm hit that would have killed a younger man. Gideon found shelter in a cave system near the upper reaches, where ancient pines grew so thick they blocked the sun even in summer. The whiskey ran out on the 4th day. He'd sat there, rifle across his knees, listening to the wind howl through the rocks, and found he couldn't do it. Not because he wanted to live, but because Eleanor's voice kept whispering in his memory, "Promise me you'll find your way back to joy, Gideon. Promise me you won't let my dying make you forget how to live." He'd made that promise on her deathbed, holding her hand as the fever took her. Now, sitting in that cold cave, he realized he'd been breaking it every day since. The wolf pup had changed everything. Scout, though he hadn't named her then, had stumbled into his camp on the 7th day, barely alive from blood loss and infection. Something had torn her hindquarters, probably a bear or mountain cat. She couldn't have been more than 4 months old, still showing the blue eyes that would later turn amber. Gideon had always been good with animals. His father had taught him that gentleness toward creatures was the mark of true strength. "Any fool can dominate through fear," the old man used to say. "Takes wisdom to earn trust." For 3 weeks, Gideon nursed that pup back to health, sharing his meager supplies and hunting small game when his provisions ran low. Scout responded like she understood he'd saved her life. She'd curl against his chest during the cold nights, her warmth somehow reaching parts of his soul the whiskey never could. When Scout's pack found them, Gideon expected to die. Ghost appeared first, massive and silent as his name suggested. Then Storm, darker and more aggressive, hackles raised and teeth showing. River came last, smaller but clearly the pack's scout, circling their camp with predatory grace. They should have killed him. Wolves don't typically accept human intrusion, especially not a grieving man who smelled of death and whiskey. But Scout had limped over to Ghost, pressing against the alpha's side, while making soft, whining sounds Gideon had never heard before. Whatever passed between them in that moment transcended human understanding. Ghost had approached slowly, yellow eyes locked on Gideon's face. The wolf was enormous, probably weighed close to 150 pounds, with shoulders that reached Gideon's chest. One swipe of those claws could open a man's throat. Instead, Ghost had sniffed Gideon's outstretched hand, then sat back on his haunches and issued a low rumble that might have been approval. The pack had adopted him. For 2 months, Gideon lived as part of their family. He learned their language of looks and sounds, their hierarchy and hunting patterns. They taught him patience he'd forgotten in 20 years of business deals. They showed him loyalty that put most humans to shame. And slowly something inside him began to heal. Not the grief that remained would always remain, but the will to live, the understanding that Eleanor's love hadn't died with her, it had just taken a different form. She'd always wanted him to be gentler, more connected to the natural world she loved. Somehow, through these wolves, he was honoring her memory better than any monument or charitable donation ever could. When he finally returned to Silver Pine in late winter, he hadn't expected them to follow. But they did, padding silently behind midnight like an honor guard. They took up residence in the woods behind his mansion, close enough to respond if he needed them, far enough to avoid the growing crowds of curious onlookers. Now, 3 months later, the town still hadn't adjusted to their new reality. "Mrs. Henderson won't let her children walk past your place no more," Tom had continued during that first official visit. "Says them wolves are watching, waiting for something. They're protective, not predatory," Gideon had replied. "Children are actually safest thing in the world around them. Wolves understand innocence better than most people. But try explaining that to folks who'd grown up on stories of Little Red Riding Hood and tales of savage beasts. Try explaining that these wolves had shown him more humanity than he'd found in most boardrooms or bank meetings. Doc Whitmore's theories proved more interesting than Tom's diplomatic concerns. The old physician had sought Gideon out privately, curiosity overcoming caution. "I've been reading," Doc had said, settling into the chair across from Gideon's desk. "Indigenous stories from the tribes that used to hunt these mountains. They have legends about spirit wolves, guides for souls lost between worlds." "You think I'm lost between worlds, Doc? I think you died up there in them mountains, spiritually speaking, and I think something or someone sent them wolves to bring you back." Doc's eyes had held more understanding than fear. "Question is, what are you supposed to do with this second chance?" The question haunted Gideon more than any of the town's whispered suspicions. What was he supposed to do? Continue accumulating wealth that meant nothing? Return to the cold calculations that had built his empire? Or had Eleanor's death and the wolves' acceptance created an opportunity for something entirely different? He'd started walking through town with them, not to frighten people, but to show them the wolves meant no harm. Ghost would heel beside him like a trained dog, while the others spread out in formation, alert but non-threatening. Shop owners nodded nervously. Children peered from behind their mothers' skirts. Old-timers crossed themselves and muttered prayers. But gradually, some began to see what Gideon saw. Mrs. Patterson, the schoolmarm, had been the first. Her cat had gotten stuck on the church roof during a storm. Scout had somehow communicated the problem to Gideon, leading him to the church, where the old woman stood wringing her hands in the rain. Together, they'd rescued the cat, and Mrs. Patterson had thanked not just Gideon but Scout as well, scratching the wolf's ears like she was any other helpful creature. The real test had come 2 weeks ago, when little Billy Morrison went missing during a family picnic up near Miller's Creek. Search parties had combed the area for hours with no success. That's when Gideon had quietly asked Ghost for help. The pack had found Billy in 20 minutes, following scent trails human noses could never detect. They'd stayed with the boy, keeping him warm and calm until the rescue party arrived. Billy later told everyone that the big dogs had sung him lullabies and brought him water from the creek. Maybe that's when the fear began shifting to something like wonder. Still, Gideon understood the town's uneasiness. Change came hard to mountain communities, especially change that challenged fundamental beliefs about the natural order. He'd been patient before. He could be patient now. Time had a way of wearing down suspicion, especially when backed by consistent proof of good intentions. He closed the pocket watch and slipped it into his vest. Time to face another day of whispered conversations and sideways glances. But also time to continue building something Eleanor would be proud of, a legacy based on connection rather than dominance, on understanding rather than fear. Outside, Ghost stretched and yawned, revealing teeth that could tear a man apart, but never would. The other wolves stirred, sensing Gideon's movement through the house. They knew his routines better than any human, responded to his moods with sensitivity that sometimes unnerved him. Today felt different, though. There was tension in their posture, an alertness that spoke of distant threats rather than local curiosity. Ghost's ears were pricked toward the eastern road, the one that led down from the mining camps and beyond. Something was coming. Gideon stepped onto his porch, morning air sharp with pine scent and the promise of spring. The wolves had formed their protective circle, no longer relaxed. Their message was clear even without words. Danger approached, and they were ready. After 6 months of peace, Gideon's past was finally catching up with him. The blood-stained telegram arrived with the morning mail, though Tom Brennan wouldn't discover the blood until later. The message itself was clean enough, written in the careful script of a man who'd learned his letters late in life. Gideon Vance, 15 years is long enough to wait, time to pay your debts. Arriving Silver Pine today. C. M. Tom read it twice before the implications settled like a stone in his gut. Clayton Morse. He'd hoped never to hear that name again, hoped the stories about him dying in a gunfight down in Mexico had been true. Should have known better, men like Clayton didn't die easy. The blood on the telegram's edge belonged to the telegraph operator in Millerville, the town 20 miles east where Clayton must have sent the message. Tom didn't learn this until later, when the circuit rider brought word that young Pete Wilson had been found beaten unconscious in the telegraph office, his face a mask of bruises and his right hand broken in 3 places. That was Clayton's signature: always leave a message nobody could ignore. Tom found Gideon in his study, the wolves arranged in a protective semicircle around the house like they'd sensed trouble coming with the dawn. Ghost's massive head tracked the sheriff's approach, amber eyes holding intelligence that still unnerved Tom after 3 months. "We got problems," Tom said, handing over the telegram. Gideon's face went stone still as he read. The only sign of his inner turmoil was the way his left hand found his wedding ring, turning it slowly around his finger, a gesture Tom had noticed whenever painful memories surfaced. "How long since you heard from him?" Tom asked. 15 years. Thought he was dead. So did most folks. Word was he got himself killed in a cantina fight down in Sonora. Guess word was wrong. Gideon set the telegram on his desk like it might bite him. Outside, Storm began pacing along the tree line, hackles raised. The wolves always knew when their human was distressed, but this felt different, deeper, more dangerous. "You want to tell me what debt he's talking about?" The silence stretched long enough for Tom to wonder if Gideon would answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of old regrets. "We were partners once, Clayton and me, fresh out of the East, looking to make our fortunes in mining. I had the education, he had the muscle. Seemed like a fair arrangement. What changed? I learned he was cutting corners that got men killed. Safety equipment costs money. Clayton used to say, dead miners don't demand wages." Gideon's hand moved to the watch chain across his vest. "I bought him out, took control of the mines, made sure every man who went down came back up alive. That doesn't sound like betrayal." "No, but what happened next did." The wolf had risen to his feet, every line of his body radiating alert tension. Clayton had been skimming from the mining payroll for months. When I discovered it, he'd already stolen enough to bankrupt 3 families whose husbands had died in his unsafe mines. Money that should have gone to widows and orphans. Tom began to understand. "You turned him in." "I gave him a choice: make restitution or face charges. He chose to run, but not before swearing he'd return someday to balance the scales." Gideon picked up the telegram again, studying the familiar handwriting. "He always blamed me for his exile, never accepted responsibility for his own choices. 15 years is a long time to hold a grudge. Clayton's the type of man who feeds on hatred. Probably kept him alive when decent men would have died." Gideon moved to the window, watching his wolves arrange themselves in defensive positions. "Question is, what does he want now?" They didn't have to wait long for an answer. Clayton Morse arrived in Silver Pine at high noon, riding at the head of a group that made honest folk step off the sidewalks and find urgent business indoors. 6 men, all carrying themselves with the loose-limbed confidence of professional gunfighters. Clayton himself looked older, but no softer lean as a whip, with graying hair and eyes like winter ice. He'd traded the rough mining clothes Tom remembered for a black suit that spoke of money acquired through questionable means. Tom met them in the street outside the jail, badge catching the sunlight and hand resting easy on his gun butt, not threatening, but ready. "Clayton Morse," he said, voice carrying just enough to reach the ears, pressed to windows up and down Main Street. "Been a long time." "Sheriff Brennan." Clayton touched his hat brim in mock courtesy. "You're looking well for an old man." "Well enough." "What brings you back to Silver Pine?" "Unfinished business with an old partner." Clayton's gaze moved past Tom toward the mansion on the hill. "Heard tell Gideon's taken up some interesting hobbies since his wife passed. Stories about him running with wolves now, making deals with spirits. Sounds like grief might have addled his mind." "Gideon's mind is sharp as ever." "Is it now?" Clayton's smile held no warmth. Well, I suppose we'll find out. You see, Sheriff, your friend owes me something that can't be measured in money. Took something from me that cost 15 years of my life. He took nothing that wasn't rightfully owed to the families you cheated. Matter of perspective. Clayton gestured to his men, who spread out in a practiced formation. I've spent 15 years learning new ways of looking at old problems. Turns out, when a man loses everything he holds dear, it clarifies his priorities something wonderful. The wolves appeared before Gideon did. They materialized from the forest like grey ghosts, moving with predatory silence until they formed a line across Main Street. Ghost took point, massive and imposing, while Storm flanked left and River flanked right. Scout, smallest but quickest, positioned herself where she could respond to threats from any direction. Clayton's men reached for their weapons before their leader's raised hand stopped them. Well, well, Clayton murmured, genuine fascination replacing his cold amusement. The stories weren't exaggerated. How do you suppose a grieving businessman manages to earn the loyalty of wild predators, Sheriff? What kind of man do wolves accept as pack leader? Gideon appeared at the top of the street, walking with the measured pace of someone who'd faced death before and found it wanting. He wore no gun, hadn't carried one since Eleanor died, but his bearing spoke of quiet confidence that made weapons seem unnecessary. "Hello, Clayton." "Gideon." Clayton dismounted, his movements careful and controlled. "You look different. Older, sadder, but maybe a little wilder around the eyes. Grief changes a man. Does it now? Interesting thing about grief, it can break a person or remake them entirely. Question is, which happened to you up there in the mountains?" Ghost growled low in his throat, a sound that vibrated through the ground and made Clayton's horses sidestep nervously. The other wolves remained motionless, but their attention focused on Clayton with laser intensity. "Remarkable," Clayton continued, seemingly unbothered by the display. "I've heard of men training dogs, even bears. But wolves? That takes something special. Something supernatural, perhaps. What do you want, Clayton?" "Justice. Recompense. A reckoning 15 years in the making." Clayton's voice rose enough to carry to every listening ear. "You destroyed my life, Gideon Vance. Sent me into exile, cost me everything I'd worked to build. Now I hear you've found yourself a new family, new loyalties. Must be comforting, having such devoted protectors." The threat hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. "You want me? You've got me," Gideon said quietly. "But this town and these wolves have nothing to do with our past." "Oh, but they do." Clayton's smile returned, cold as mountain snow. "See, I've learned something about justice over the years. Sometimes the only way to hurt a man properly is to take away what he loves most. You took my future, Gideon. Now, I'm thinking it's time to return the favor." Clayton remounted his horse, but his eyes never left the wolf pack. "I'll be staying at the hotel. Give you some time to consider your options. But here's the thing about time, it runs out eventual. And when it does, we'll see just how far your new friends are willing to go to protect a man who's already lost everything that matters." He wheeled his horse around, his men following in formation. But just before they rode off, Clayton called back, "Mighty fine town you got here, Sheriff. Be a shame if something happened to disturb the peace." As the dust settled behind their departure, Ghost moved closer to Gideon, pressing against his leg in a gesture of solidarity that somehow managed to be both comforting and ominous. The other wolves maintained their formation until the riders disappeared around the bend, then melted back into the forest as silently as they'd appeared. Tom approached carefully, aware that tensions remained high despite the enemy's temporary retreat. "He's planning something," Tom said. Gideon nodded, his hand finding Ghost's massive head. "Clayton never makes empty threats. If he says he'll hurt innocent people to get to me, he means it. Then we'd better figure out how to stop him." "No, Tom." Gideon's voice carried the finality of a man who'd made a hard decision. "This is my fight. I won't let my past endanger people who've done nothing wrong." But as they stood there in the empty street, Ghost's rumbling growl suggested the wolves had different ideas about abandoning family, human or otherwise. Eleanor's leather journal lay open on Gideon's desk, her careful handwriting a bridge across the chasm of death that separated them. He'd avoided reading her final entries for 6 months, afraid of what her last thoughts might reveal. Now, with Clayton's threat hanging over Silver Pine like storm clouds, he found himself searching for guidance in the only place it might still exist. The entry, dated 3 days before her death, made his breath catch. "My dearest Gideon grows more distant each day, and I fear not just my body is dying, but his heart as well. If I could leave him one gift beyond my love, it would be this, that he learns to forgive, starting with himself. The anger he carries toward those who have wronged him will poison whatever years remain to him. I have written to Marcus, though I doubt my letter will bridge the gap between father and son. Perhaps in losing me, they might find each other again. My greatest regret is not seeing that reunion." Gideon's hands trembled as he turned the page. Eleanor had known about Marcus's estrangement, understood the pride that kept both men silent when they should have been healing old wounds. She'd tried to mend what he'd broken, even as fever consumed her strength. "The wolves chose you for a reason," he whispered to her memory. "But I still don't understand what you want me to do." Outside, Storm paced the perimeter of the property, her restlessness reflecting Gideon's inner turmoil. The pack had been agitated since Clayton's arrival, sensing threats their human couldn't yet fully comprehend. Ghost lay near the study window, massive head raised, amber eyes tracking movement in the town below. Tom Brennan's approach registered first with the wolves, then with Gideon, as the animal's posture shifted from alert to accepting. The sheriff climbed the front steps with the heavy gait of a man carrying unwelcome news. "Doc Whitmore wants to see you," Tom said without preamble. "Says it's about Eleanor." The walk to Doc's office felt longer than usual, every step shadowed by curious eyes and whispered conversations. Clayton's men had taken rooms at the hotel, their presence like a poison spreading through the town's bloodstream. Honest folk hurried about their business, while children were kept indoors despite the fine spring weather. Doc Whitmore's office smelled of carbolic acid and the medicinal herbs he grew behind the building. The old physician looked older than his 68 years, silver hair disheveled and eyes red-rimmed from lack of sleep. "Gideon, sit down. We need to talk about something Eleanor asked me to keep secret." "What kind of secret?" Doc pulled a sealed envelope from his desk drawer, Eleanor's elegant script across the front reading, "For Gideon, when he needs guidance most. She made me promise to give you this only if you faced real danger, the kind that might tempt you back to violence." Doc's weathered hands shook slightly as he passed over the letter. "Seems like that time has come." Gideon broke the seal carefully, as if Eleanor's words might scatter like ashes if handled roughly. Her final message was brief but devastating in its clarity. "My beloved husband, if Doc is giving you this letter, then the past has found you, as I always feared it would. You have spent 15 years trying to atone for Clayton's sins, carrying guilt that was never yours to bear. But guilt can become its own kind of pride, a way of avoiding the harder path of true forgiveness. I do not ask you to forgive Clayton. Some wounds run too deep. But I ask you to forgive yourself, and to forgive Marcus for the angry words spoken when grief made both of you cruel. Our son needs his father, just as you need the family you still have left. The wolves accepted you because they see what I see, a man capable of great love despite the walls he builds to protect his heart. Do not let fear of losing again prevent you from living again. Your loving wife, Eleanor." The silence stretched long enough for Doc to clear his throat uncomfortably. When Gideon finally looked up, his eyes held unshed tears and something else, a flicker of hope he'd thought dead forever. "She wrote to Marcus," Gideon said quietly. 3 letters, actually. Posted them myself." Doc leaned back in his chair. Eleanor was determined to mend what she saw as her greatest failure, watching father and son destroy their bond over pride and pain. Did he respond? That's between you and the boy. But Eleanor believed love could survive even the deepest wounds, given time and patience. Doc's voice softened. Question is, are you willing to try? Before Gideon could answer, Tom burst through the office door, face flushed with exertion and alarm. Clayton's made his move, Tom gasped. His men are demanding protection money from every business on Main Street. Says it's insurance against unfortunate accidents. The old rage stirred in Gideon's chest, familiar and seductive. Clayton was using the same tactics he'd employed in the mining camps, intimidation masked as business. But Eleanor's words echoed in his memory. Do not let fear of losing again prevent you from living again. How much time did he give them? Gideon asked, forcing his voice to remain calm. Until sunset tomorrow. Says after that, he can't guarantee the safety of anyone who refuses his generous offer. Gideon stood, Eleanor's letter still clutched in his hand. Through Doc's window, he could see Ghost and the pack arranging themselves in defensive positions, ready to protect what they'd claimed as family. Tom, I need you to send a telegram. To who? Marcus Vance, Denver. Gideon's voice carried new resolve. Tell him his father needs him, and his mother's memory deserves better than a family divided by pride. The sheriff nodded, understanding passing between old friends without need for explanation. What about Clayton? Clayton wants a reckoning, but it's going to be on my terms, not his. Gideon folded Eleanor's letter carefully, placing it inside his vest pocket next to his heart. And it's going to be about protecting what matters, not destroying what I hate. Outside, Scout's sharp bark drew their attention to the street below. Clayton himself stood in front of the general store, his black suit, a stark contrast to the dusty browns and greys of the mountain town. He was talking to Mrs. Henderson, the woman who ran the store with her elderly husband. Even from this distance, they could see her fear in the way she wrung her hands and kept glancing toward the hills where she knew the wolves watched. He's enjoying this, Tom muttered. He always did. Gideon watched Clayton tip his hat to the terrified woman before strolling away, every gesture calculated to demonstrate his power over innocent people. But enjoyment can make a man careless, especially when he thinks he's already won. Doc Whitmore had remained silent during their exchange, but now he spoke with the authority of someone who'd seen enough violence to understand its true cost. Eleanor believed in you, Gideon. Believed you'd find a way to protect what you love without becoming what you hate. Don't prove her wrong. As they left the doctor's office, Gideon felt the weight of choice settling on his shoulders like a familiar yoke. The easy path led backward to the cold calculations and ruthless efficiency that had built his fortune. The harder path led toward something Eleanor had always seen in him, but he'd never quite believed the possibility that strength could serve love rather than fear. The wolves were waiting when he reached the street, Ghost padding silently to his side. The great wolf's presence reminded Gideon that family came in many forms, but loyalty remained constant. Whether human or animal, those who chose to stand together could face any threat. Clayton wanted to test the bonds that held Gideon's new life together. Time to show him how strong those bonds had become. The carved wolf totem fit perfectly in Gideon's palm, its smooth surface worn to a gentle sheen from months of handling. He'd whittled it during his darkest days in the mountains, when grief had driven him to the edge of madness, and only the simple repetition of blade on wood had kept his hands steady. Now, sitting in the cave where he'd first found peace, he understood why his fingers had shaped the wood into this particular form. They'd been carving his future before his mind could accept it. The pack had followed him into the high country without question, their loyalty transcending human concepts of safety and strategy. Ghost lay across the cave entrance, massive body blocking the narrow passage while remaining alert to threats below. Storm and river patrolled the surrounding ledges, their grey forms nearly invisible against the granite. Scout remained closest to Gideon, her amber eyes reflecting the firelight as she watched his face for signs of decision. 3 days had passed since Clayton's ultimatum began, 3 days of Gideon wrestling with choices that seemed to offer only pain, no matter which direction he turned. Stay and fight, and innocent people would suffer. Run again, and Clayton would pursue him until one of them lay dead. There had to be another way, but the mountain silence offered no easy answers. The memory of that first night with Scout remained vivid in his mind. He'd found the wounded pup during a blizzard that should have killed them both, her small body broken and bloody from what looked like a bear attack. Any sensible man would have put her out of her misery and moved on. Instead, Gideon had gathered the dying animal against his chest, sharing his warmth and what little food he possessed. For 2 weeks, he'd nursed her back to health while snow blocked the high passes. During those endless days and nights, something profound had shifted inside him. Caring for another living creature, even one that might never recover, had awakened parts of his heart he'd thought dead with Eleanor. Scout's gradual healing had somehow begun his own. When the pack found them, Gideon had expected death. Wild wolves didn't tolerate human interference with their young, but Ghost had approached carefully, studying the man who smelled of his missing pack member. What passed between them in that moment remained beyond human understanding, some communication deeper than words or gestures. The pack had tested him first. They'd watched him hunt, seen how he shared his kills with Scout, even when food was scarce. They'd observed his patience when she cried in pain, his gentleness when changing her bandages. Slowly, cautiously, they'd begun to accept that this strange two-legged creature might be worthy of trust. Storm had been the last to accept him, the most suspicious of human motives. But even she had eventually acknowledged what the others already knew. Gideon's grief had stripped away the civilized pretenses that usually separated man from nature. In his raw pain, he'd become something wolves could understand, a creature seeking family, willing to sacrifice for the pack's survival. Now, as he carved new details into the wooden totem, Gideon wondered if that acceptance had been preparing him for this moment. Clayton's return wasn't just about old debts or business betrayals. It was a test of what he'd learned in these mountains, what the wolves had taught him about loyalty and sacrifice. A distant howl echoed through the peaks, answered immediately by River from her position on the eastern ridge. Not alarm, but communication. Someone was approaching on the trail below. Scout's ears pricked forward, head tilted toward the sound. A moment later, Ghost rumbled deep in his throat, a sound that meant recognized friend rather than unknown threat. Tom Brennan's voice carried through the thin mountain air, calling Gideon's name with the careful respect of someone who understood he was entering wild territory. The sheriff appeared at the cave mouth 20 minutes later, breathing hard from the climb, but determined to deliver his message. "Your boy's coming," Tom said without preamble. "Telegraph came this morning. Marcus will be on tomorrow's stage." Relief and terror warred in Gideon's chest. 15 years of separation, 15 years of pride and stubborn silence, coming to an end whether he was ready or not. Eleanor's letters had apparently accomplished what his own attempts at reconciliation never could. "What did you tell him?" "Nothing but what you asked. His father needs him, and his mother's memory deserves better." Tom settled carefully on a rock outcropping, mindful of the wolves' watchful presence. "But I'm thinking he deserves to know what he's walking into. Clayton won't hurt him. Whatever else my former partner has become, he's not the type to harm innocents without cause." "You sure about that?" Man who'd beat a telegraph operator for sport might have fewer scruples than you remember. The truth of Tom's words settled like a stone in Gideon's gut. The Clayton he'd known 15 years ago had been ruthless but not sadistic. Time and exile could change a man in ways that defied prediction. "I'll come down tomorrow before the stage arrives," Gideon decided. "Marcus shouldn't face this blind. And Clayton can wait. Family comes first." Gideon turned the wooden wolf in his hands, feeling the grooves and curves his knife had carved during those long nights of healing. Besides, he's the one who forced this confrontation. Let him wonder what I'm planning while he sits comfortable in his hotel room. Tom nodded approval. Waiting's harder than acting, especially for a man used to getting his way through force. As if summoned by their conversation, Scout moved closer to Gideon, pressing her warm flank against his leg. The gesture reminded him of those first desperate weeks when touch had been the only communication possible between them. She'd taught him that healing required patience, that strength sometimes meant enduring rather than fighting. Tom, I need you to do something else for me. Name it. Keep the townspeople calm. Clayton's counting on fear to divide us, make us easier to manipulate. If folks start panic buying or sending their families away, he wins without firing a shot. What should I tell them? Gideon stood, the carved wolf secure in his palm. Around him the pack stirred with anticipation, sensing decisions being made that would affect them all. Tell them Gideon Vance isn't running anymore. Tell them he's got family to protect and a home worth fighting for. He looked out across the valley, where Silver Pine nestled among the pines like a child's toy village. And tell them the wolves of Silver Pine don't abandon their pack. As Tom began the treacherous descent back to town, Gideon remained in the cave mouth, watching shadows lengthen across the mountain slopes. Tomorrow would bring Marcus, the son he'd driven away with harsh words and harder expectations. Tomorrow would begin whatever reckoning Clayton had planned. But tonight, surrounded by creatures who'd chosen loyalty over safety, Gideon felt something he hadn't experienced since Eleanor's death hope, tempered with purpose. The wooden wolf in his hand seemed to pulse with warmth, a talisman of transformation carved from grief and polished by acceptance. Whatever came next, he wouldn't face it alone. The faded photograph trembled in Gideon's weathered hands as the afternoon stage rounded the bend into Silver Pine. 20 years had passed since the picture was taken, Gideon and Eleanor flanking a gap-toothed 8-year-old Marcus beside the creek behind their old house. Eleanor's radiant smile dominated the frame, her arm around their son, while Gideon stood slightly apart, even then maintaining the emotional distance that would eventually drive his family apart. He'd found the photograph in Eleanor's jewelry box after her funeral, tucked between letters she'd saved from Marcus's brief time at college. On the back, her careful script had noted, "Before pride built walls between the hearts that matter most." Another of her gentle rebukes, delivered from beyond the grave to remind him of what he'd lost through his own stubborn nature. The stagecoach lurched to a stop in front of Henderson's general store, dust swirling around the wheels as passengers disembarked. Gideon recognized Marcus immediately, despite the passage of years. His son had grown tall and lean like his grandfather, with Eleanor's intelligent eyes and her gift for seeing deeper truths than most people bothered to seek. Marcus stepped down from the stage with the careful movements of someone expecting trouble. His gaze swept the street, taking in the unusual emptiness, the shuttered windows, the subtle signs of a town holding its breath. When his eyes found Gideon standing in the shade of the hotel porch, 15 years of separation collapsed into a single moment of mutual recognition and uncertainty. "Hello, Marcus." "Father." The word carried no warmth but no hostility either, just the careful neutrality of someone testing dangerous ground. They stood facing each other across the dusty street. Two men who'd once been family, now separated by pride, grief, and the accumulated weight of words that couldn't be taken back. Ghost materialized from the shadows between buildings, his massive presence drawing Marcus's startled attention. "The stories are true, then," Marcus said, studying the wolf with the analytical eye of a man who'd learned to judge threats quickly. "You really do travel with wolves now." "They're family," Gideon replied simply. "Interesting definition of family, considering how you treated the one you were born with." The barb hit its target, but Gideon absorbed it without flinching. He'd earned worse through 15 years of stubborn silence. "Your mother left letters for you," he said instead of defending himself. "3 of them. Doc Whitmore has them." Something shifted in Marcus's expression. Surprise, perhaps, or the first crack in armor built from old hurts. "She wrote to me before she died. She tried to heal what I'd broken." Gideon stepped closer, noting how his son's hand instinctively moved toward the gun at his hip. "Whatever brought you here, Marcus, whatever those letters said, we need to talk. But not here, and not now." "Why not now?" Before Gideon could answer, Clayton Morse emerged from the hotel like a shadow detaching itself from a wall. He moved with predatory confidence, flanked by two of his hired guns, whose hands rested casually near their weapons. "Well, well," Clayton drawled, his cold eyes moving between father and son. "Family reunion. How touching." Marcus's posture shifted subtly, the relaxed stance of a traveler replaced by the coiled readiness of someone expecting violence. Gideon noticed the change with mingled pride and concern. His son had learned to handle himself in dangerous situations, but that knowledge came with a price no father wanted his child to pay. "Clayton Morse," Gideon said by way of introduction. "My former business partner. Marcus, my son." "The son who couldn't stand his daddy's company," Clayton observed with malicious pleasure. "Heard tell you lit out for Denver the day after your mama's funeral. That must have stung, Gideon losing wife and son in the same week. Leave him out of this, Clayton. Your quarrel's with me." "Oh, but that's where you're wrong." Clayton's smile held all the warmth of a winter wind. "See, I've spent considerable time thinking about justice, about what it means to balance the scales. You took everything from me, my business, my reputation, my future. Seems only fair I return the favor." The threat hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. Ghost growled low in his throat, the sound vibrating through the wooden planks beneath their feet. Other wolves appeared at the edges of Gideon's vision: Storm near the bank, River behind the blacksmith shop, Scout crouched beneath the hotel's front steps. "You want to hurt my family to get to me," Gideon said quietly. "I want you to understand what loss feels like," Clayton corrected. "Real loss, not just the natural grief that comes to every man. I want you to know what it's like to lose everything through another man's choices." Marcus stepped forward, his movement placing him slightly between his father and Clayton's guns. The gesture was subtle but unmistakable. Whatever their past conflicts, blood still called to blood when threats emerged. "I don't know what history you share with my father," Marcus said, his voice carrying the measured calm of someone who'd faced armed men before. "But I'm not part of your grievances." "Aren't you?" Clayton's eyes glittered with malicious amusement. "You're his son, his blood, his chance at legacy. Taking you away would hurt him worse than any bullet. You'd have to catch me first." "Oh, I don't need to catch you, boy. I just need to make your daddy choose." Clayton's gaze returned to Gideon. "Here's how this works, old friend. You come with me, face what you've got coming, and your son walks away free. Try to run or fight, and, well, accidents happen to young men in mountain country. Bears, wolves, sudden avalanches. Dangerous place for city folks who don't know the terrain." The choice Clayton offered was no choice at all, and they all knew it. Submit to whatever vengeance he'd planned, or watch Marcus die for sins that weren't his to bear. "How long do I have to decide?" Gideon asked. "Until tomorrow at dawn. After that, my patience runs out and your boy starts learning about mountain hazards the hard way." Clayton touched his hat brim in mock courtesy. "Enjoy your family reunion. Might be the last one you get." He turned and walked away, his men following with the loose-limbed confidence of predators who knew their prey couldn't escape. As their footsteps faded, father and son stood alone in the street, with only the wolves for company. "I'm not leaving," Marcus said before Gideon could speak. "This isn't your fight. It became my fight the moment he threatened me to get to you." Marcus's jaw set with familiar Vance stubbornness. "Besides, I didn't come all this way just to watch you sacrifice yourself to a madman. Then why did you come?" Marcus pulled a worn envelope from his jacket, one of Eleanor's letters, obviously read many times over the years. "Because Mama asked me to forgive you," he said quietly, "and because I finally figured out that forgiveness isn't about forgetting the past, it's about not letting the past destroy the future." Ghost padded closer, his amber eyes moving between the two men as if recognizing something important in their exchange. The great wolf had always possessed an uncanny ability to sense human emotions, especially those involving family bonds. "We'll face this together," Marcus continued. "But first, I want to hear everything about Clayton, about what happened between you, about these wolves who've claimed you as pack. If we're going to survive what's coming, I need to understand what I'm fighting for." Gideon looked at his son, truly looked at him for the first time in 15 years, and saw Eleanor's wisdom tempered by hard experience, her compassion strengthened by a man's understanding of the world's harsh realities. "All right," he said, tucking the photograph back into his vest pocket next to Eleanor's final letter. "Let's go home, and I'll tell you everything." "But Marcus?" "Yes? You should know that coming here, standing with me against Clayton, it's the proudest moment I've had since your mother died." For the first time since stepping off that stage, Marcus smiled, a ghost of the gap-toothed grin from the old photograph, but genuine nonetheless. The brass compass caught the lamplight as Gideon turned it slowly in his palm, its polished surface reflecting memories of better days. Eleanor's wedding gift to him 32 years ago, engraved with words that had guided him through every major decision of their marriage. "Find your way home." She'd meant it literally then, a practical gift for a man whose mining ventures took him deep into unmapped territory. Now, facing the hardest choice of his life, he understood she'd been speaking about something deeper than geographic navigation. They sat in his study as shadows lengthened outside, father and son, separated by 15 years of silence, but united by immediate danger. Marcus had read Eleanor's letters twice, his face cycling through emotions Gideon remembered, from childhood, wonder, pain, understanding, and finally a kind of peace that spoke of wounds beginning to heal. "She never stopped believing we'd find our way back to each other," Marcus said quietly, setting the final letter aside. "Even when the fever was taking her, she spent her strength trying to mend what we'd broken." "I should have written to you after the funeral," Gideon admitted. "Should have swallowed my pride and tried to explain why I said those things. And I should have stayed for the funeral instead of running like a wounded animal." Marcus studied his father's weathered face, seeing lines carved by grief and loss. "We were both hurting, both angry at God for taking her away. Easier to blame each other than face the fact that some things just happen, no matter how much we love someone." Outside, Ghost's low rumble signaled the pack's evening patrol. The wolves had been restless since Clayton's ultimatum, sensing the tension that gripped their human family. Storm and River flanked the house's perimeter, while Scout remained close to the front door, ready to alert them to approaching threats. "Tell me about Clayton," Marcus said, settling back in Eleanor's reading chair. "What kind of man are we really dealing with?" Gideon's hand found the compass again, its weight a reminder of moral certainties that had guided him through previous crises. "Clayton was ambitious when we partnered up, but not evil. Cutting corners to increase profits was common practice back then. Most mine owners figured dead workers were just part of the business." Gideon's voice carried the weight of old regrets. "I thought I could change his mind, with evidence, show him that safety measures actually improved productivity in the long run. But he wasn't interested in long-term thinking. No, Clayton wanted fast money and quick results. When the Widow's Peak mine had that cave-in, killed 3 men and injured a dozen others, I discovered he'd removed safety supports to reach a promising vein faster." The memory still brought bile to Gideon's throat. Children who'd never see their fathers again because Clayton couldn't wait another month for proper excavation. Marcus leaned forward, understanding dawning in his eyes. "That's when you bought him out. I gave him a choice. Either we do business my way, with proper safety standards, or I buy his share and run things alone. He took the money, but he wasn't happy about it." "And the embezzlement?" Gideon's jaw tightened as he remembered discovering Clayton's theft. I found the books 6 months later while settling accounts with the workers' families. Clayton had been skimming from the death benefits, money that was supposed to help widows feed their children. He'd stolen over $3,000 more than most folks saw in 5 years. You could have handled it quietly. I should have, probably. Would have saved everyone a lot of trouble. Gideon stood and moved to the window, watching Ghost's silhouette against the starlit sky. But I was young and righteous and convinced that justice mattered more than consequences. I gave Clayton one chance to make restitution. When he refused, I turned him over to Sheriff Mills. He ran before trial, disappeared the night before his arraignment, along with what remained of the stolen money, left behind a letter promising he'd return someday to balance the scales. Gideon turned the compass once more, Eleanor's inscription catching the light. I thought 15 years was long enough for a grudge to cool. Should have known better. Marcus stood and joined his father at the window. Below them, silver pines settled into evening quiet, lights glowing in windows where families gathered for supper and conversation. Normal life continuing despite the storm clouds gathering on their horizon. "Clayton's not the same man you knew," Marcus observed. 15 years of exile, probably living by violence and cunning that changes a person, makes them harder, more ruthless. You sound like you speak from experience. I've seen men broken by loss, by pride, by the need for revenge. Marcus's voice carried knowledge earned through hard years. In Denver, I work for the Territorial Marshal's Office. I've tracked enough fugitives to recognize the type men who've let hatred consume everything good in them until only the hunger for payback remains. Gideon felt surprise and pride war in his chest. "You're a lawman?" "Deputy marshal, actually. Started as a clerk after college, but found I had a talent for understanding how desperate men think." Marcus smiled ruefully. "Probably inherited that from you, the ability to see what motivates people, what they'll sacrifice to get what they want." "And what does Clayton want, in your professional opinion?" "More than simple revenge. If he just wanted you dead, he could have bushwhacked you on one of your rides into the mountains. No, he wants you to suffer first, wants you to feel helpless, trapped, forced to choose between impossible options." The truth of Marcus's analysis settled over them like a cold mountain wind. Clayton wasn't seeking quick vengeance. He was orchestrating an elaborate punishment designed to destroy everything Gideon cared about before finishing him. "He'll hurt innocent people to get to me," Gideon said quietly. "Count on it. Men like Clayton view bystanders as tools to be used or obstacles to be removed." Marcus placed a hand on his father's shoulder, the first voluntary contact they'd shared in 15 years. "But he's also impatient, and impatience leads to mistakes. If we can make him angry enough, frustrated enough, he might overplay his hand. Or he might just start killing people to make his point. Maybe, but there's something else, something he's not accounting for." Marcus gestured toward the window, where Ghost's massive form stood sentinel in the moonlight. "He's expecting to face the Gideon Vance he knew 15 years ago, a wealthy businessman who solved problems with money and influence. He's not prepared for what you've become." "What have I become?" "A man with a wolf pack for family and nothing left to lose except the people he loves." Marcus's eyes held respect, tinged with something like awe. "That makes you more dangerous than Clayton realizes, and it gives us advantages he can't anticipate." Outside, Scout's sharp bark signaled an approaching rider. The wolves melted into defensive positions as hoofbeats echoed through the night air. A moment later, Tom Brennan's voice called out, requesting safe passage through the pack's territory. "Sheriff's coming," Gideon observed. "Probably with news about Clayton's preparations." "Good. We'll need to know his movements, his resources, his timeline." Marcus checked his weapon automatically, the gesture of someone who'd learned to always be ready. "But first, I want to ask you something." "What?" "Eleanor's compass. What would she tell you to do if she were here? Gideon looked down at the brass instrument, its needle pointing steadily north despite the chaos surrounding them. Eleanor had always been his moral compass, guiding him toward choices that honored love over fear, compassion over vengeance. She'd tell me that protecting family means more than personal revenge, he said finally. She'd remind me that some battles are worth fighting, not because we hate our enemies, but because we love what they're trying to destroy. Then we fight, Marcus said simply, not for revenge against Clayton, but to protect this town and these people who've become your family. As Tom's boots echoed on the front porch, father and son stood together in the lamplight, separated by years of hurt, but united by purpose. The brass compass lay between them on the windowsill, its inscription catching the light like a promise. Find your way home. They were already there. The hidden will lay spread across Tom Brennan's desk like a map to buried treasure, its legal language dense with implications that reframed everything they thought they knew about Clayton's return. Eleanor's careful signature graced the bottom of the document, dated just 2 weeks before her death, a final secret she'd kept even from Gideon in those last precious days. She what? Gideon's voice barely rose above a whisper. Left half her personal estate to establish a wildlife sanctuary, Tom repeated, studying the document Doc Whitmore had retrieved from Eleanor's safety deposit box that morning. Says here the land's supposed to be managed in perpetuity for the protection of native species, with special emphasis on wolf habitat preservation. Marcus leaned over the desk, his marshal's training evident in how he analyzed the legal text. This is ironclad, filed with the territorial government, witnessed by 3 separate parties, completely binding under territorial law. But I never saw this, Gideon protested. Eleanor never mentioned, because she knew you'd try to talk her out of it, Doc Whitmore interrupted from the corner where he'd been quietly observing their shock. Eleanor came to me 3 weeks before she passed, asked me to help her research the legal requirements for land preservation. Said she'd found her true calling in your stories about the mountains, the way you described feeling connected to something larger than human ambition. The implications crashed over Gideon like an avalanche. Eleanor hadn't just accepted his transformation in the wilderness, she'd been planning for it, preparing for a future where her husband's spiritual awakening could serve a purpose greater than personal healing. The timing, Marcus said suddenly, his voice sharp with understanding. Clayton didn't just choose now randomly. He knows about this will. Tom's weathered face hardened. How could he know? It was sealed until this morning. Because he's been planning this for months, maybe longer. Think about it. He arrives just as spring brings the wolves down from the high country, just as town gossip about father's transformation reaches peak intensity. That's not coincidence. But how would he have learned about Eleanor's will? Doc Whitmore cleared his throat uncomfortably. Eleanor wrote several letters in her final weeks. I assumed they were all to Marcus, but she wrote to Clayton. Gideon finished, the pieces falling into place with sickening clarity. Not to Clayton directly, no, but she did correspond with someone in Denver who claimed to be researching local wildlife preservation efforts. Said he was writing articles for Eastern newspapers about Western conservation movements. Doc's voice carried the weight of unwitting betrayal. Eleanor was so excited to help, so proud that your experience with the wolves might contribute to protecting their habitat. The silence stretched taut as they absorbed this revelation. Eleanor's final act of love had become the weapon Clayton would use to destroy everything she'd hoped to protect. The land descriptions, Marcus said, still studying the will. These boundaries, they include the entire wolf territory, don't they? The high meadows, the cave systems, the winter hunting grounds. Every acre, Gideon confirmed, his voice heavy with newfound dread. Eleanor mapped it all during our courtship, back when I was still surveying mining claims in the high country. She said the mountains were too beautiful to spoil with excavation. Tom's badge caught the lamplight as he leaned back in his chair, the burden of sheriff's authority weighing heavy on his shoulders. So Clayton's not just after you, Gideon. He's after the land itself. The most valuable undeveloped territory west of the Divide, Marcus added grimly. Rich in timber, probably minerals too, worth more than all of Father's other holdings combined. But the will protects it, Doc Whitmore protested. Legal preservation status means it can't be developed or sold. Only if Eleanor's heir lives to implement her wishes, Marcus corrected. If Father dies without issue, the land reverts to territorial control, and territorial land can be purchased by anyone with enough money and the right political connections. The trap's elegant simplicity left them all momentarily speechless. Clayton had engineered circumstances where Gideon's death would not only satisfy his thirst for revenge, but also deliver a fortune in virgin wilderness into his hands. Eleanor's gesture of love and conservation would be twisted into an instrument of environmental destruction. He knows I won't run, Gideon said quietly, knows I can't abandon the wolves or the town to save myself. So he's forced a confrontation where every choice leads to the same result. Not every choice, Marcus said, turning from the window with renewed determination. We're missing something, some angle Clayton hasn't considered. Before anyone could respond, Scout's urgent howling shattered the evening quiet. The young wolf's alarm call echoed through the streets, answered immediately by Ghost's deeper voice from somewhere near the mansion. Other wolf voices joined the chorus until the entire town rang with warning cries that raised goosebumps on human skin. That's not their normal patrol signal, Gideon said, moving toward the door. Tom grabbed his rifle from the wall rack. What's got them so stirred up? The answer came in the form of distant gunshots, 3 quick reports from the direction of the mining road. Scout appeared on Main Street, racing toward them with her distinctive limp more pronounced than usual. Blood matted the fur along her left flank. Someone shot her, Marcus said, drawing his weapon as they rushed outside. Scout stumbled to a halt in front of Gideon, whining and pawing at his leg while looking back toward the mountains. Her message was clear. The pack was under attack. Clayton's forcing the issue, Tom realized. He's not waiting until dawn. More gunshots echoed from the high country, accompanied by the enraged howling of wolves driven to fury. Ghost's voice rose above the others in a sound none of them had heard before, a call that seemed to shake the mountains themselves. He's hunting them, Gideon said, his voice deadly quiet. Clayton's hunting my family. With poisoned bullets, most likely, Marcus added grimly. Standard technique for eliminating wolf packs doesn't require accuracy, just contact. The pieces of Clayton's strategy became horrifyingly clear. He wasn't just threatening violence, he was systematically destroying everything that mattered to Gideon before moving in for the final confrontation. The wolves, the town, the land Eleanor had died, protecting all of it, was being sacrificed to one man's twisted need for vengeance. We have to stop him, Gideon said, checking Scout's wound with gentle hands. The bullet had grazed her hip, painful but not life-threatening. It's a trap, Tom warned. He wants us up there in the dark, on his ground, fighting on his terms. Maybe, but I won't let him slaughter my pack while I hide in town. Gideon's eyes held a cold fire that reminded both men of the businessman who'd once dominated the territorial mining industry. Besides, Clayton's made one crucial mistake. What's that? He thinks this is still about him and me, about old business and older grudges. Gideon straightened, his hand finding Eleanor's compass in his vest pocket. But it stopped being personal the moment he threatened my family. Now it's about protecting something bigger than revenge. Marcus holstered his weapon and moved to his father's side. Then we go together. All of us. Destan, son, you don't understand what you're volunteering for. I understand perfectly. Marcus's voice carried the quiet certainty of someone who'd found his true purpose. Eleanor's will doesn't just protect wolf habitat, it protects a way of life, a connection between man and nature that most of the world has forgotten. That's worth fighting for, worth dying for if necessary. Tom nodded slowly. the authority of his badge lending weight to his words. County law gives me jurisdiction over wildlife protection. This just became official business. As if summoned by their resolve, Ghost appeared at the edge of town, his massive form silhouetted against the starlit sky. The great wolf's eyes held intelligence and something that might have been approval as he studied the three men preparing to defend his territory. Behind him, Storm and River emerged from the shadows, their hackles raised and teeth bared. The pack that had adopted Gideon was ready to fight for the family that had accepted them in return. Clayton wanted a reckoning, Gideon said quietly, studying Eleanor's will one final time. Time to give him one he'll never forget. The Winchester rifle felt foreign in Gideon's hands after months of carrying only his father's hunting knife and the wisdom the wolves had taught him about solving problems without violence. The weapon had belonged to his grandfather, then his father, passed down through generations of men who'd used it to feed their families and protect their land. Now, as he checked the action one final time, Gideon understood he faced a choice that would define not just his own future, but the legacy he'd leave behind. "Feels strange, doesn't it?" Marcus observed, watching his father handle the rifle with obvious reluctance. "Taking up arms, when everything you've learned points toward a different path." "The wolves don't hunt for sport or revenge," Gideon replied, setting the Winchester aside. "They kill only when necessary to protect the pack, to survive, but they don't hesitate when that moment comes." Tom Brennan finished loading extra ammunition into his saddlebags, the methodical preparations of a man who'd faced armed conflict before. Around them, Silver Pine hummed with quiet activity as townspeople who'd chosen to stay made their own preparations. Mrs. Henderson had turned her general store into a makeshift medical station. The blacksmith, Murphy, had fashioned crude but effective weapons for those who owned no firearms. Even old Doc Whitmore had cleaned his father's cavalry saber, the blade gleaming with memories of distant battles. "Clayton's counting on fear to divide us," Tom said, adjusting his badge one final time. "Figures folks will panic, scatter, leave us isolated and outnumbered. Instead, they're rallying," Marcus observed with something like wonder in his voice. "Why?" The answer came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Patterson, the schoolmarm, approached their position near the church with a group of older children in tow. Her usually stern face showed calm determination as she addressed the men preparing for battle. "Mr. Vance, the children wanted you to have this." She handed him a carefully folded paper, their young voices having crafted a message in crayon and careful pencil strokes. "Thank you for keeping the wolves safe. They protect us too." Gideon's throat tightened as he read signatures from every child in Silver Pine, even those whose parents had initially feared his return from the mountains. Below the names, someone had drawn a picture of a man standing beside 4 wolves, all of them facing the same direction as if watching for threats. "They understand what most adults miss, Mrs. Patterson continued. "The wolves aren't dangerous to those who mean no harm, but they're absolutely deadly to anyone who threatens what they protect. That makes this town safer, not more dangerous. And that's why we're standing with you," added Murphy the blacksmith, his massive hands gripping a sledgehammer that could crush skulls as easily as iron. "Clayton's not just threatening you and your wolves. He's threatening the idea that good folks can build something worth protecting without violence and greed." The crowd that had gathered represented a cross-section of Silver Pine's population miners who'd worked Gideon's claims for years, shopkeepers who'd prospered from the town's growth, families who'd found refuge in the mountains from harder lives elsewhere. They weren't warriors, but they were something Clayton hadn't anticipated, a community united by shared purpose. "We can't ask you to fight our battles," Gideon protested. "You're not asking," Tom replied firmly. A familiar howl echoed from the mountains, answered immediately by Ghost's powerful voice from somewhere near the tree line. The pack was moving into position, their supernatural coordination evident in how the calls formed a pattern of communication no human ear could fully decode. "They're telling us Clayton's forces have split up," Marcus interpreted, his lawman's experience with tracking allowing him to read meaning in the wolf song. "Multiple groups moving down different trails, trying to surround the town." "How many men does he have?" Murphy asked. "Started with 6, Tom answered. "Could be more by now, plenty of drifters and guns for hire in the mining camps who'd sign on for easy money." Gideon studied the positions his human and wolf families were taking, noting how naturally they'd adapted to fighting together. Ghost commanded the eastern approaches, where his size and intelligence could best counter mounted attackers. Storm and River held the northern passes, their speed and coordination perfect for harassment tactics. Scout, despite her wound, had claimed the southern trail, the route that led directly to Eleanor's intended sanctuary. "Clayton's not just trying to kill us," Gideon realized suddenly. "He's testing the bonds between man and wolf, trying to prove they'll break under pressure." "Will they?" Marcus asked quietly. Instead of answering, Gideon walked to the edge of town, where Ghost waited in the shadows. The great wolf's amber eyes held intelligence that sometimes unnerved even those who'd accepted the pack's presence. But tonight, those eyes also held something else, absolute trust in the human who'd earned his loyalty through months of shared hardship and mutual respect. "You don't have to stay," Gideon told the wolf, knowing Ghost would understand his tone if not his words. "This is human foolishness, human greed. Your pack could disappear into the high country, avoid the whole conflict." Ghost's response was to move closer, pressing his massive shoulder against Gideon's leg in a gesture of solidarity that needed no translation. Behind him, the other wolves emerged from concealment, Storm with her aggressive readiness, River with her tactical intelligence, Scout with her stubborn courage despite injury. "They've made their choice," Marcus said, approaching slowly to avoid startling the pack. "Same choice Eleanor made when she decided to protect their territory, same choice we're all making tonight, which is that some things matter more than survival. Some bonds are worth dying for." The sound of approaching horses interrupted their conversation, riders coming fast down the eastern trail. But instead of Clayton's men, Tom's deputies emerged from the darkness, led by his second-in-command, Deputy Mills. "Sheriff, we got word there was trouble," Mills called out, his horse lathered with sweat from hard riding. "Brought every man we could spare from the other towns." "How many?" 15 good men, all armed and ready." Mills dismounted, studying the wolves with careful respect. "Also brought word from the Territorial Marshal's office. Seems there's been considerable interest in Clayton Morse's activities lately." Marcus stepped forward, his badge catching the moonlight. "What kind of interest?" "The kind that comes with federal warrants," Mills replied. "Turns out our Mr. Morse has been busy since his exiled bank robbery in Colorado, cattle rustling in Wyoming, suspected murder in Arizona Territory. The territorial governors put a bounty on his head that'd keep a man comfortable for years." The news rippled through the gathering crowd, like water through a dry riverbed. Clayton wasn't just a bitter former partner seeking revenge. He was a wanted fugitive whose return to Silver Pine represented a threat to far more than Gideon's family. "Changes things," Tom observed grimly. "Can't let him escape to continue his rampage elsewhere." "Also explains why he wants this settled quick and final," Marcus added. "He's running out of places to hide, needs the money from Eleanor's land to disappear permanently." Another howl echoed from the mountains, but this one carried different tones, urgency mixed with warning. Ghost's head snapped toward the sound, his body tensing with predatory alertness. "They're coming!" Gideon translated unnecessarily. The next few minutes passed in organized chaos as defenders took their assigned positions. Townspeople who couldn't fight retreated to the church and school, buildings that offered the best protection from stray bullets. Those who could handle weapons spread out to cover the approaches Clayton's men would most likely use. "Remember," Tom called out, his voice carrying the authority earned through decades of keeping peace in hard country, "we're not murderers. Give them a chance to surrender before shooting. But if they choose violence, don't hesitate to defend yourselves and your neighbors. Gideon found himself positioned near the bank with Marcus and 3 of Tom's deputies. The Winchester lay across his knees, ready but not eager. Beside him, Ghost maintained perfect stillness, every sense focused on detecting threats before they became visible to human perception. "You scared?" Marcus asked quietly. "Terrified," Gideon admitted, "not of dying, but of what might happen if we fail. Eleanor's sanctuary, the wolves' habitat, this community, all of it depends on what we do in the next few hours. Then we don't fail." Marcus checked his weapon one final time, his movements calm, despite the tension that gripped the entire town. "We fight for what matters, and we trust that love is stronger than hate." The brass compass in Gideon's vest pocket seemed to pulse with warmth, Eleanor's final guidance still pointing toward home. But home wasn't a place anymore. It was the bonds between creatures who'd chosen to stand together against those who would destroy rather than protect. "Here they come." Ghost's low growl warned a split second before the first riders appeared at the edge of town. Clayton Morse rode at their head, his black silhouette unmistakable even in the uncertain moonlight. Behind him, 8 men spread out in attack formation, their weapons glinting with deadly intent. The battle for Silver Pine and for Eleanor's legacy was about to begin. The silver sheriff's star caught the first rays of dawn as Tom Brennan pinned it to Gideon's vest. The badge representing more than law enforcement, it carried the weight of community, trust, and the responsibility to protect rather than destroy. Clayton's attack had begun with the sunrise, his men firing from concealed positions while the wolves coordinated their defense with supernatural precision. "You're officially deputized," Tom gasped, blood seeping from a bullet graze along his shoulder. "Whatever happens next, you've got legal authority to do what's necessary." "Tom, you need medical attention. I need to see this finished first." The sheriff's weathered face showed pain but unshakable resolve. "Mrs. Henderson's got the medical station ready. I'll live long enough to watch Clayton answer for his crimes." The first wave of attackers had struck simultaneously from 3 directions, exactly as Marcus had predicted. Clayton's men knew their business, professional gunfighters who moved with practiced coordination, but they hadn't expected the wolves. Ghost had materialized from the pre-dawn shadows like his namesake, taking down the lead rider before the man could fire a shot. The massive wolf's attack wasn't savage but surgical, designed to disable rather than kill. Storm and River flanked the eastern group, their coordinated harassment breaking the attackers' formation and forcing them into defensive positions. "They're not fighting like animals," Deputy Mills observed with amazement, watching River circle behind 2 gunmen who'd taken cover behind the blacksmith shop. "They're fighting like soldiers." "Pack tactics," Marcus explained, checking his ammunition. "Wolves understand strategy better than most humans. They're isolating threats, controlling territory, protecting vulnerable positions." The strategy was working. Clayton's initial advantage in numbers and firepower was being neutralized by defenders who knew every building, every alley, every vantage point in Silver Pine. More importantly, they were fighting for something beyond personal gain. They were protecting their chosen family. Scout's sharp bark from the southern approach warned of new movement. Despite her wound, the young wolf had maintained her position, guarding the trail to Eleanor's sanctuary. Now she signaled that Clayton himself was making his move. "He's trying to flank us," Gideon realized, studying the pattern of gunfire. "Draw us into the main fight while he circles around to attack from behind. Or he's going for the sanctuary directly," Marcus countered. "If he can destroy the land Eleanor wanted to protect, he wins even if we stop his men." The choice crystallized in Gideon's mind with painful clarity. Stay and help defend the town, or pursue Clayton to protect Eleanor's final gift to the world. Either way, people he cared about would face danger without his protection. "I have to go after him," Gideon decided. "Not alone," Marcus said immediately. "Son, I need you here coordinating with the deputies. This town needs someone who understands how Clayton thinks. And you need someone watching your back. Marcus's jaw set with familiar Vance stubborn. We've spent 15 years apart because of pride and misunderstanding. I'm not losing you again to some misguided notion of noble sacrifice. Before Gideon could argue, Ghost padded over and pressed his massive head against both men's legs, a gesture that somehow managed to be both comforting and commanding. The great wolf's amber eyes held intelligence that transcended species barriers, and his message was unmistakable. Family stays together. All right, Gideon conceded. But we do this smart. Clayton's desperate, which makes him dangerous in ways we can't predict. They moved through Silver Pine's back streets like shadows, using the cover of buildings and morning mist to avoid Clayton's remaining gunmen. The sounds of battle continued behind them, sporadic gunfire punctuated by shouted commands, and the occasional howl as the wolf pack communicated tactical information across the battlefield. The trail to Eleanor's sanctuary wound through dense pine forests that muffled sound and limited visibility. Ghost ranged ahead, his supernatural senses alert for ambush, while father and son followed in careful formation. Years of separation fell away as they moved together, sharing an understanding that needed no words. "There," Marcus whispered, pointing toward a clearing where smoke rose from what should have been pristine wilderness. Clayton had reached the heart of Eleanor's intended sanctuary and was systematically destroying it. Ancient trees lay felled across the meadow where wolves had denned for generations. A small fire consumed the wooden markers Eleanor had placed to delineate the protected boundaries. The man himself stood in the center of the destruction, his black suit incongruous against the devastated landscape. "He's not just stealing the land," Gideon breathed. "He's destroying it out of pure spite. Some men can't bear the idea that beauty might exist without their permission," Marcus replied grimly. Clayton's voice carried across the meadow as he noticed their approach. "Gideon, come to watch your wife's folly burn. Fitting, don't you think? Her dreams turning to ash, just like your pathetic attempt at redemption." "It's over, Clayton," Gideon called back, the silver star on his chest catching the morning light. "Your men are defeated, the town's safe, and there are federal warrants with your name on them. Nothing's over until I say it's over." Clayton's hand moved toward his gun, but his eyes remained fixed on Ghost, who'd positioned himself between the humans and potential threats. Remarkable creatures, wolves, absolutely loyal until something better comes along. "How long do you think they'll stay faithful when the shooting starts, old friend?" "Long enough," Gideon replied quietly. The standoff stretched taut as mountain air. 3 men and 1 wolf facing each other across a meadow that represented everything at stake in their conflict. Eleanor's vision of protected wilderness, the bond between man and nature that had transformed Gideon from businessman to guardian, the possibility that love could triumph over hate, all of it balanced on the edge of violence. Clayton's smile held no warmth as his hand settled on his weapon. "Let's find out." Eleanor's locket pressed against Gideon's chest as he faced Clayton across the devastated meadow, its weight a reminder that love endured beyond death, beyond hatred, beyond the destructive fury of men who'd forgotten what truly mattered. Inside the gold case were 2 photographs, one of Gideon from their wedding day, young and hopeful, the other of Marcus as a child, gap-toothed and innocent. Eleanor had worn it every day of their marriage, her faith in family never wavering, even when pride threatened to tear them apart. "You always were sentimental," Clayton sneered, noticing how Gideon's hand moved instinctively to the locket, clinging to the past while the world moves on without you. "Your wife's dead, Gideon. Her dreams died with her. Time to face reality." "Eleanor's dreams are very much alive," Marcus said quietly, his weapon trained on Clayton but his voice steady. "They're alive in this land, in the wolves who call it home, in the community that's chosen to protect it." "Community." Clayton spat the word like a curse. a handful of frightened shopkeepers and worn-out miners following a madman who talks to animals. You think that's strength? You think that's worth dying for? Ghost's low growl provided the answer, a sound that vibrated through the ground and made Clayton's horse sidestep nervously. The great wolf's amber eyes held intelligence that transcended human understanding, and his position between the men spoke volumes about where his loyalties lay. "The wolves understand something you never learned," Gideon said, his hand moving away from his weapon toward the locket that held his heart. "Family isn't about blood or obligation. It's about choice, choosing to stand together when everything else falls apart." Pretty words from a man about to die for his principles. Clayton's gun cleared leather with practiced speed, but his shot went wide as Ghost launched himself across the meadow. The massive wolf moved like liquid lightning, covering 30 yards in seconds that felt like hours. Clayton's second shot caught Ghost in the shoulder, spinning the great animal but not stopping his charge. They collided in a tangle of fur, fangs, and desperate humanity. "No!" Gideon's cry echoed across the meadow as he ran toward the struggle, Marcus close behind. But Ghost wasn't fighting to kill, he was fighting to protect, his powerful jaws clamping down on Clayton's gun arm with enough force to shatter bone but not tear flesh. The man screamed, dropping his weapon as the wolf's weight bore him to the ground. "Call him off!" Clayton gasped, his face pale with pain and terror. "Call him off or I'll—" "You'll what?" Marcus had reached them first, his own weapon trained on the fallen man. "You're finished, Clayton. Your men are dead or captured, your plans are ruined, and you're looking at federal prison if you're lucky." Ghost released Clayton's arm and stepped back, blood matting his silver fur, but his eyes still alert. The wound wasn't mortal, but it was serious enough to need attention. Gideon knelt beside his injured friend, hands gentle as he examined the bullet track along the wolf's shoulder. "Easy, boy. You did good. You protected the family." "Family." Clayton laughed bitterly from where he lay, clutching his mangled arm. "You really believe that, don't you? You think those animals actually care about you, that this town actually accepts your madness?" "They don't have to believe it," said a new voice from the tree line. "We know it." Tom Brennan emerged from the forest, his shoulder bandaged but his bearing strong. Behind him came Deputy Mills and 3 other lawmen, their badges glinting in the morning sun. Behind them came something even more remarkable, a dozen townspeople who'd left the safety of Silver Pine to ensure their protector's safety. Mrs. Henderson carried medical supplies for Ghost's wound. Murphy, the blacksmith, brought rope to secure Clayton for transport. Even Mrs. Patterson had come, her schoolma'am's authority somehow fitting as she surveyed the destruction of Eleanor's meadow with disapproving eyes. "The children will help replant," she announced matter-of-factly. "They've already started gathering seedlings, say they want the wolves to have their home back properly." Storm and River appeared from opposite sides of the clearing, their tactical positioning perfect even now. Scout limped out of the trees, favoring her wounded hip, but determined to join her pack. The 4 wolves arranged themselves around their human family, creating a circle of protection that included everyone who'd chosen loyalty over fear. "You see, Clayton?" Gideon said softly, helping Ghost to his feet while maintaining gentle pressure on the wound. "This is what you never understood. Family isn't about controlling others, it's about being worthy of their trust." Clayton's eyes moved from face to face, human and animal alike, seeing perhaps for the first time what he'd spent 15 years trying to destroy. Not weakness, but strength. Not madness, but clarity. Not the past, but a future built on foundations stronger than hatred. "Eleanor knew," Gideon continued, opening the locket to show Clayton the photographs inside. "She knew that love creates bonds that outlast the people who make them. This sanctuary isn't just about protecting wolves, it's about protecting the idea that different species can choose to build something together." Tom stepped forward with shackles, his voice carrying the weight of territorial law. "Clayton Morse, You're under arrest for armed assault, destruction of protected land, and about a dozen federal charges that'll keep you locked up for the rest of your natural life." As they secured Clayton for transport, the man who'd once been Gideon's partner looked up with eyes that held something that might have been regret. "It could have been different," he said quietly. "We could have built an empire together." "We built something better," Gideon replied, his hand finding Ghost's uninjured shoulder. "We built a family." The sanctuary deed lay spread across the same desk, where Eleanor had once planned their household accounts and dreamed of a different future. Its official seals and signatures transforming her vision into protected reality. 6 months had passed since the battle that saved Silver Pine, 6 months of healing for both the land and the creatures who called it home. Now, as autumn painted the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, Gideon and Marcus prepared to sign the document that would make Eleanor's dream permanent. "She would have loved this moment," Marcus said, his pen poised above the signature line. "Seeing her sanctuary officially established, knowing the wolves will have protected territory for generations to come." "She's here," Gideon replied quietly, his own signature joining his son's on the legal document. "I feel her presence every time Ghost leads the pack through the meadow, every time Scout plays with the new pups, every time the mountains echo with wolf song." Ghost himself lay beside the desk, his shoulder wound long healed, but leaving a streak of white through his silver fur, a badge of honor from the day he'd protected his chosen family. The great wolf's amber eyes tracked their movement with the patient intelligence that had first drawn Gideon to accept his place in the pack hierarchy. Outside, the sounds of Silver Pine's daily life continued as they had for generations, but with new undertones that spoke of change and growth. Children's laughter mixed with the distant howling of young wolves learning pack dynamics. Merchants conducted business with the knowledge that their town was protected by bonds deeper than law or custom. Visitors came now, naturalists, writers, artists drawn by stories of the man who lived with wolves and the community that had embraced an impossible partnership. "The territorial governor wants to make this a model for other preservation efforts," Marcus noted, folding the completed deed with careful precision. "Says investors back east are interested in funding similar projects throughout the mountain territories." "Eleanor would have been pleased by that too," Gideon agreed. "She always believed small acts of protection could grow into something larger." Tom Brennan's recovery had been slower than the wolves', his shoulder wound requiring weeks of careful nursing by Doc Whitmore. But the sheriff had returned to duty with renewed purpose, his badge now representing more than local law enforcement. The federal government had appointed him as the official supervisor of wildlife protection efforts, a position that suited his temperament perfectly. "Any word on Clayton's trial?" Gideon asked as Tom entered the study. "Sentenced to 20 years in territorial prison. Assuming he lives that long, man his age. With his reputation, prison's not kind to former outlaws who've made too many enemies." Tom settled into Eleanor's reading chair, which had become his unofficial seat during their planning sessions. "Justice served, I'd say." The irony wasn't lost on any of them. Clayton's quest for revenge had ultimately given them everything they'd fought to protect: legal recognition of the sanctuary, federal support for wolf preservation, and a community united by shared purpose rather than divided by fear. "Scout's been asking about the new territory markers," Tom continued with the straight face of someone who'd learned to accept wolf communication as natural fact. "Wants to know if she's supposed to patrol the entire boundary or just the sections near town." "Tell her the entire boundary," Gideon replied, without missing a beat. "But remind her that Storm and River are supposed to help. She's still recovering from that hip wound." Marcus shook his head in wonderment. 6 months ago, I would have thought this conversation was proof of madness. Now it seems like the most natural thing in the world. The change in Marcus had been as remarkable as his father's transformation years earlier. The angry young man who'd fled Silver Pine after his mother's funeral had returned as someone who understood that family came in many forms, that loyalty could transcend species barriers, and that protecting what you love sometimes required accepting gifts from unexpected sources. "The Denver Marshal's office has offered me a permanent position here," Marcus announced suddenly, "overseeing territorial wildlife protection, working with local communities to establish preservation partnerships." And I accepted. Figure it's time I stopped running from family and started building something worth staying for. Gideon felt warmth spread through his chest, not the fire of business ambition that had once driven him, but the gentle heat of contentment that came with knowing all the important pieces of his life had found their proper places. Storm's howl from the tree line signaled the evening patrol beginning, her voice soon joined by River's deeper call and the excited yips of the year's new pups. 3 of them now, born in the security of protected territory to parents who'd never known the fear of human predation. "They're teaching them the boundaries," Gideon observed, listening to the complex harmonies that meant pack business to ears that had learned to understand their language. "And the children are learning too," Tom added. "Mrs. Patterson's got the whole school studying wolf behavior, plant restoration, natural conservation, says it's the best science education she's ever been able to provide." As evening shadows lengthened across Silver Pine, the 3 men sat in comfortable silence, surrounded by the evidence of Eleanor's continuing influence on their world. Her books still lined the shelves. Her garden still bloomed behind the house, tended now by Marcus with the same care she'd once shown. Her dream of harmony between human civilization and wild nature had become the foundation upon which their entire community now stood. "You know what she'd say if she were here?" Gideon asked, touching the locket he still wore close to his heart. "What? That love doesn't end with death, it just finds new ways to grow." He stood and moved to the window, where Ghost's massive silhouette was visible against the star-filled sky. "She loved me enough to set me free in those mountains, loved Marcus enough to write letters that brought him home, loved the wolves enough to ensure their territory would remain protected, and loved this community enough to trust us with something bigger than ourselves," Marcus added. Outside, the wolf pack's evening song rose into the mountain air, their voices carrying across valleys where other packs were learning that human partnership could mean protection rather than persecution. Eleanor's sanctuary had become the first of many, her vision spreading like seeds on mountain wind. "Tomorrow I start teaching the new conservation officers," Marcus said. "Government sending a dozen men to learn how to work with local communities, how to build partnerships instead of imposing regulations." "Eleanor's legacy," Gideon murmured, watching Ghost lead his pack toward the high meadows where they'd hunt under starlight. She knew that changing hearts was more powerful than changing laws. As Silver Pine settled into evening quiet, the man who'd once been the richest west of the divide understood he'd finally found the treasure that mattered most, a family chosen through love rather than obligation, a purpose that served creation rather than exploitation, and the knowledge that Eleanor's spirit lived on in every wolf howl, every child's laugh, every moment when different species chose to stand together against the darkness.